really keen to have this conversation. Jonny Steinberg is in studio with us. Thank you so much for being here. Good evening and welcome.
It's very good to be here. Thank you.
No. It's good for us to have you. Thank you for coming through. Okay, this book is the talk of the town, as you know. I'm sure you know that by now, Jonny. It is the talk of the town because, for me, nonetheless, you're an award winner and you've written a lot about what I believe to be ordinary people who have these extraordinary lives. And so when I saw this and I thought, okay, so he's taking on big personalities, big people. And I wasn't sure. And I also thought, the subject, we've all kind of read about these people. We know enough. What's new? And then I'll come to the third element, the title. Okay? It's about the two most famous people I think this country's ever had. Winnie and Nelson. I was struck by why it starts with Winnie and not Nelson. And Winnie, Portrait of a Marriage. So let's start maybe with the title. Winnie and Nelson, not Nelson and Winnie. Why?
Well, I think I can actually answer that by answering your second question first, which is why the book at all.
Yeah.
I was originally going to write a book on Nelson Mandela rather than on the marriage. And the reason was simple, that I think that after he died, it became possible to write about him in a new way. It became possible to write about him as a human being. It really hadn't been possible before. And that was the initial motivation. And very early on in the research, I discovered, much to my surprise, just by reading the letters he was writing to Winnie from prison, that he was falling more and more in love with Winnie as the years in prison went by. But more than just falling in love, he was making her the very center of his world, of his identity. It was how he stayed sane, how he stayed a person. And yet he was at the same time losing touch with who she was. He hadn't seen her in a long time. And you see in his letters this confusion where in one paragraph she'll be a young beauty, 19 years old. In the next paragraph she'll be 55 years old. He was losing the arc of time. He was losing being with her. And I was surprised. I thought he was a political being down to his bones. But the longer he was in prison, the more of a private being he became, the more this marriage, began to constitute who he was. And I thought the marriage is a really interesting intro into him, insight into him, and maybe the marriage is more interesting than him alone. It just seemed fascinating.
You speak of these letters, and I just want to read a little bit of an extract from some of the letters. I hope to be with you long after you have reached menopause, when all the gloss you have now will be gone, and your body, your lovely face included, will be all wrinkled, skin as tough as that of a rhinoceros. That's part of what he says. And I think everybody now is thinking, oh, that's so romantic. But it was complex. It was much more complex than that. This was somebody he had, as you said, conjured up in his mind. He was in love with more a fantasy than the real Winnie, because they'd been apart for so long.
And that letter shows how little he knew her anymore, because telling Winnie that she was growing old was the worst thing in the world to tell her. And she, he sometimes knew, sometimes didn't, but her lovers were always much younger than her. She stayed young, through her lovers largely. And I think that his letters disturbed her, because she understood with every letter that he was frozen in time, that he was reliving the 1950s over and over and over, because he had nothing else. Whereas she was living a life without him. She was becoming an adult, a grown woman, and then even an elderly woman. She was living a full life, and I think she understood long before him that marriage was hollowing out.
So one of the things that makes this book interesting is that, as I said, this is a story we know. But then you make us ask the question, do we really know the story? And how much of the story was more a narrative than it was the real story, particularly in the beginning? And then there is this, we need to ask ourselves more nuanced questions about, to what extent was this more a story to help us with our political situation than it was a real story? So there's a lot of questions there, and how it plays out, its existence in the South African body politic.
Well, that's exactly right, because they, in the 1950s when they met, they were both very, very ambitious people. And they both, I think much more than anyone else around them, understood the political power of celebrity. They understood what it meant politically for a beautiful, glamorous black couple to be photographed. They got that their image meant a lot, that there was real substance there. And they, from the beginning, wanted their marriage to be exemplary, to tell the story of their people. And it ended up doing so in such powerful ways. You know, he went to prison, she was left outside. And the story was this beautiful, famous couple would finally be reunited on the day their people were free. And their marriage became the story of South Africa. And that's what they wanted. And that's what was built globally. Their brand was built that way across the world. And by the 1980s, they were the most famous couple in the world.
You had this mammoth task of showing us together and separately how you could really find this balance of not being too kind or too sweet or too tough. And I was wondering, actually, I thought, okay, so you have been living in the US for how long now?
I live in the UK, actually. I've been there for 11 years. Yeah.
And I thought, okay, so you're not here in South Africa. Here you are writing from outside. And I was keen to see whether your location, to what extent it had influenced your sense of lens of our politics. How Western were your lenses now, since you had been living in the UK, you say now, for 11 years? And did you find that challenging?
It's a good question, and the answer is I really don't know. I've been so involved with South Africa, ever since I took a teaching job in the UK 11 years ago. I've been coming back 4 times a year. My work is about here. My engagement with people is about here. So it kind of feels like a dual life. I still feel very involved here. But yeah, every book is written from somewhere, from some perspective. But I guess a choice I self-consciously made was to try and leave myself behind as much as I could and tell the whole book through a combination of 2 things. One, complete honesty, and not to flinch and not to leave out any story because it was too uncomfortable. But at the same time, to tell every story with the deepest sympathy available to me, no matter what that story was.
So, okay, my answer to you is that yes, you have. You've told it like a South African, which is fantastic, which is great. And you have told it, and I was speaking to somebody earlier, you've absolutely mastered telling the story with empathy, which I think is really a great takeaway for me. And I wondered about some of what you tell. You had great access. You had these letters that were quite intimate. I mean, there's stuff that you say and you give us an insight. I felt like a little fly on their wall, a little uncomfortable, really uncomfortable for me as a reader to see the detail. How difficult was it for you to tell us the detail?
So I took a decision that I wasn't going to censor any material, that I could tell any story, no matter how intimate. And the rule was that it was not what I told, but the way I told it. And that if it's told in a way that humanizes, if it's told in a way that brings you towards these people and not away from them, then it's fine. But having said that, I don't know that I'm right, and I'm not the best judge of that. So, the reader is the best judge. And when you say you feel uncomfortable, I hear you. And maybe I pushed the limits too far. I really don't know.
Well, it's going to give us also a lot of thinking, because memory is an interesting thing. So things happen, and then there are major events in our lives. And for instance, you must have seen how the country, especially young people, responded to Winnie's death. Very different to how Winnie had been portrayed before as a celebrity, as a political figure globally in the country by the media. And this book, I think, is going to bring us other conversations, actually, because there are details we've known but weren't ready to go there. You speak of, for instance, Winnie's affairs, right? And yeah, one understands that, and I think I know that Madiba understood that. He understood, he's been gone for a long time and so on. But that some of those relationships were of with spies, and she wouldn't be told by anybody not to continue with those relationships, giving the movement quite an uncomfortable scenario to deal with. and it caused rifts within the ANC.
I couldn't tell Winnie's story properly. I couldn't do it justice without talking about her lovers. It would have been such a strange omission because it was central to so much in a number of ways. I mean, one is that she never moved into the political world without being very closely attached to somebody else. That is how she operated in the world. And it was a different man at a different time. But it was so central to her political being to be consumed with somebody else in politics always, and that fascinated me, and it was a fundamental part of her personality. And to try and screen that out for the sake of discretion meant that I'd be writing about a fictitious character and not Winnie Madikizela Mandela. It was just such a part of it. And another reason is that, as you've just said, her love life got her into very deep trouble, and especially in the 1960s when a man she was with turned out to be a police informer and people went to jail as a result. That incident, firstly, it nearly broke her. It nearly destroyed her political career. It came very, very close. But it damaged her. It isolated her. And a direct result of her isolation was her detention in 1969 and her solitary confinement and her horrific interrogation. And because she was isolated, her interrogator, who was a very cruel and intelligent man called Tian Swanepoel,
who knew too much.
He knew too much about her, and he knew how to use it against her.
And because she possibly had, well, not possibly, she had an affair with somebody who gave him all that insight.
Partly, and partly because she was isolated, she had to rely on people in the underground movement she was building who were people she shouldn't have been close to. And that wasn't ill judgment on her part. That's just because she was so isolated. People like Albertina Sisulu and Lillian Ngoyi refused to work with her, and she had to build an underground on her own.
Yeah, refused to work with her because of these very...
because of her relationship with the police informer.
Yeah. You also touch on other uncomfortable situations with Robben Island. Look, South Africans, black South Africans, would love for their heroes to be in this happy little... we imagined Robben Island to be this amazing place where there were wonderful ideas being shared, and it wasn't quite like that. It was tough. Govan Mbeki, Nelson Mandela, who hardly spoke for about 4 years. And we don't want to talk about that because their worldviews were so different. And it's tough to admit to the fact that actually we keep hearing that the ANC is a broad church, but how fine that the differences were and to what extent they were there even way back then.
I think enough time has passed for us to finally be honest about Robben Island. It really had a godlike mythical status for so long. The idea that every tendency got together and learned to live with each other, and there was almost a parliament there. Prison is a horrible place, and it does horrible things to people. And to think that Governor Mbeki and Nelson Mandela lived as close together as you and I are now,
wouldn't talk,
and for nearly 4 years did not greet one another. Over ideological differences, and then competed with each other brutally for the allegiances of young people when the 1976 generation got to prison. To the extent that a lot of young people gave testimony that they fell mentally ill shortly after they arrived in Robben Island, just because of the contest of the older men for their allegiances. It was so rough, it was so brutal. And an interesting thing is that testimony has been sitting there available to historians for a long time. And it's only really now that we can really tell these stories, I think.
Yeah. The ideological differences, I think, are quite key in the story because you tell the story of a marriage which actually breaks because of the ideological problems. But of course, this is also happening within the ANC. We speak of Govan Mbeki and Nelson Mandela and how far apart these ideas were. They were thinking Marxist ideas, and Madiba was reading biographies of white men who are great in Europe and in the US, quite far apart from where the movement, or at least the majority of those around him, ideologically were.
Yeah, I mean, from very early on, Nelson Mandela firmly believed that the idea that the apartheid state could be overthrown militarily was crazy. He just didn't think it was possible. He thought from the 1960s that there had to be a negotiated settlement. He also thought that if his country went to war, it would never recover. that would come from war would not be liberation but ruin. He really believed that at the bottom of his heart. And there was Governor Mbeki, meters away from him, thinking the exact opposite, that the only way apartheid could go was through a people's war, was through arming masses of ordinary people. And that is exactly the conflict that entered the Mandela marriage. By the mid-1980s, Mandela was desperate to avert civil war. Winnie was behind his back, using
violence,
using his house to train and arm young men, because she felt either there'd be a violent insurrection or apartheid would go on forever. So in this marriage, there's this fundamental conflict over how apartheid should end.
I connected the dots that this partly comes from, which is why you take us way back to their upbringing. The perspectives were so different, but they also had very little time to know each other, to really peel the layers off, because they were only together, for 2-3 years? It's
amazing how short. They met in 1957, they married in 58. By 61, Mandela was underground. They were not living together anymore and wouldn't again until 1990. So it's really 4 years.
And why I say that is that even us, those who are onlookers, see a Madiba who has this romanticized idea of how black and white South Africans were meant to relate. And even in his other books, never really spoke of his own childhood experiences with racism back in Gunu, which he must have experienced, because we do hear tales of the fact that they were harassed, when they were going out into the fields. But he doesn't talk much about that. He romanticizes all of that quite a bit.
So one of the great discoveries for me in researching this book was how angry Nelson Mandela was in the late 80s and the early 90s. He described his own life as a tragedy. The people close, a very close person to him in the early 1990s, his chief of staff, Barbara Masekela, said that she felt that she was in the presence of the saddest human being that she'd ever met. He believed that his life had been ruined, that his wife's life had been destroyed, so had his children's, and he blamed the apartheid state, and he felt immense anger. But he felt that his responsibility as a political leader was never to show that anger, that if he showed it, he would be leading his people into war, and that he would have failed. And so, he was a genius at putting on a mask, at acting. And he decided that the mask he must wear for his country's future in the 1990s was of a cheerful man, of a generous, warm, forgiving man. And I'm pretty sure that isn't what he felt. It's what he thought was needed. And history will judge whether that was the right role he should have played. Obviously, it's more and more controversial as time goes on.
And if you speak about a bit more on that, what you discovered to be his troubles in that sense, I'm struck by how he couldn't then reconcile or maybe understand more where Winnie's political ideology was at. He was more angry with her drifting ideologically than he was, I think, with the marriage problems, if you know what I mean. So the infidelity was, yes, a problem. People were talking and all of that. But I think the thing for him was politically, ideologically, I have someone here who's an adversary.
There's a lot of murkiness around that question, and there's a story that's been circulating for years now, which is that, the top leadership of the ANC came to see him and said, you have to give up your wife, and it's a political decision. There were those meetings, but I think at bottom for him it was personal. I think that he felt deeply betrayed by her. He came out of prison. I think it's hard for it to sink in how damaged somebody who's been in prison for 27 years is, and how much they're reeling. And really, the only real human life he knew was with her, in his memory, in his being, and he felt they owed it to each other to try and develop a substantial relationship again. And I think he was wrong. I think their marriage was ruined, and he didn't understand that. But he couldn't forgive her for not giving that a try. So he came out, and she really flaunted her current lover, in front of him, and humiliated him. And it took him a couple of years to discover that wouldn't change. And, he was so angry by the time that they separated that his book, Long Walk to Freedom, was about to come out. And he called his publisher in New York, and he said, I want every picture of that woman out of the book. I don't want to see her in my... And that is terrible. She was the love of his life. So I think it was a personal decision.
I don't know. I don't know. Because I'm also aware of the fact that the world had been sold this iconic couple. I mean, you know, as you said, well-heeled. They looked powerful together. They looked beautiful together. Everybody loved them. And Winnie had done a lot, actually, to her credit, to uphold that name, to continue reminding South Africa about this man.
Absolutely.
Even as she had these affairs, right?
Yeah.
And in a way, the ANC knew the power of this couple and used that internationally to kind of get us where we are today. So what I'm asking is maybe personal, but it was also very political.
Well, I mean, I've just told the story from what I believe is Nelson's perspective.
Yeah.
Winnie's perspective is that she was cast aside when she was no longer useful. I mean, that is her understanding of what happened and why he separated from her. And exactly what you've said. I mean, she knew better than anybody how she had held his name high more than any other human being in the world. Especially in the late 1970s, she was banished to Brantford. She was, the apartheid state was out to crush her spirits. And what she did was stand up and say, this country will not be free until Nelson Mandela is president. And at that time, Nelson Mandela's name was vanishing. The ANC was struggling. The uprisings of 1976 had nothing to do with the ANC. They couldn't put their name to them. They were a declining force. A couple of things turned them around, but she was one of them. She played a vital role in bringing her husband's name and her organization's name back. And yes, in the early 90s, she felt, not only did I do that, but I suffered for that. And she said occasionally, I suffered for that more than you did in prison.
Felt like he was cushioned.
So that's her perspective on what happened in the early 90s. And my task in writing this book is not to take sides, but to give both those perspectives.
Absolutely. So the letters, right? The letters had been stolen, actually.
Well, the transcripts of conversations that they had when she came to visit him in prison.
Yeah, they where did you find them? At the University
of the Free State. Yeah. So what happened is that the Minister of Justice and Prisons from 1980 to Mandela's release was Kobie Coetzee, and he ordered that all of Mandela's conversations with visitors be bugged. And he collected a big pile of transcripts and summaries, thousands of pages long. And when he left office in 1994, he took those documents with him, which is theft. I mean, they were state property. And they just sat in his garage in Bloemfontein until his wife died in 2010. And then his will said that they be taken to this archive at the University of the Free State. And they put them in the archive. Formerly, it was an open archive, but they didn't tell anybody that these papers were there. I discovered that they were there halfway through writing this book.
Really? So the book does a few things. It obviously tells us a lot about this marriage and what I think is quite a tragic story of, who knows what would have become of this relationship. But it also reveals again the brutality of the system and how it rendered us, black people, so unseen. And generationally, when you look at the story, how the wounds are so far away from being healed. Writing the story for you as a writer, there are times when I wanted to throw the book away, close the book, leave it, don't come back. No, I'm coming back. And because I suppose we relive the trauma. And also, I mean, the story is, as I said, tragic. Your experience of writing this book?
It was a pretty emotional experience, but also a really exciting experience. I rediscovered South Africa writing this book. I very presumptuously and arrogantly thought I really knew the history of my country. There was so much that I had to reconsider. It was, above all, a learning experience for me, and that's what made it so exciting.
It's complex.
Yeah.
It's very complicated. It's a gift. Thank you. It's a gift. Thanks for taking it on, because, as you said, you are going to be writing about Mandela, who is this towering figure. And then you take on very big characters, very big personalities. And I must say, I think you have been respectful in your manner of writing. And you show your love for this country in a way that I think is quite beautiful, especially now. Especially now we're not the world's favorite, and I think we don't love ourselves very much at the moment. But this book, it's a gift. I think that's what I want to say. Thank you, Jonny.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you saying that.
Thanks for coming through.
Thank you.
Can you believe it? 30 minutes is gone, just like that. Winnie and Nelson, The Portrait of a Marriage by Jonny Steinberg.